We got a lot of really interesting developments going on with Africa. Um, Traore just came back from Burkina Faso, I should say. Traore just came back from Russia, and it seemed like it was a fruitful trip with Russia. Today on Ask the Professor, we're going to dive in a little bit more and see if Russia is an ally or a potential colonizer, right? That's a question that we've had for a while. We've seen Russia fund different countries in their resistance, but they also had a presence in the Berlin Conference, right? So they have this, position that's a little bit more shrouded in mystery because they didn't necessarily take the route of the imperialists, but that's because they had their hands full with their own imperialism in their side of the world. So it's a bit more complex with Russia. You can't just pinpoint it. So let's go ahead on and call the professor and see what's cracking with this and have a conversation on that.
Hello,
Hey, what's good, Professor Pops?
how are you?
I'm good. How are you? How's your day going today?
It's there, hectic as usual.
Yeah. Yeah, hey, I understand. I understand. We're diving into the Russia topic today. Um Traore just came back and he had a seemingly fruitful relationship or fruitful visit to Russia. There were several things that were discussed, especially regarding trade, the West influencing how people view their relationship, as well as some of the mixed bag of the relationship in Africa that already exists, like the Wagner Group in Congo, right? Just to get started,
Mm.
what background knowledge do you think the viewer should have as it pertains to Russia, specifically with the overarching question today being, is Russia an ally or a colonizer? How would you begin to answer that question? What would be some of the context you start with?
I think the best analogy to give for this and to understand the context between the relationship between any country in Africa, probably with the exception of South Africa and a few North African countries, is the relationship that exists between the rich and the poor. When the poor man is sick, he goes to the rich man to say, I am sick. When the rich man is sick, the poor man still goes to the rich man to say, I understand you are sick. I think that is the best analogy to understand whatever is going on with Russia, with China, with the West and Africa. Still, it is relations of unequals and relations where the less equal needs the more equal more than the other way around. And whether we are talking about Traore or Mali quitting the French bloc and going to the Soviet, or we're talking of East African countries trying to break from the West to anywhere else, it is the same story.
Mm. So when someone asks you if Russia is an ally or an enemy, how would you begin to answer that question with that in mind?
They say in politics there are no enemies or friends, at
No,
least not
no
ones
permanent
that
allies,
last
no
long.
permanent enemies.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
what there is geopolitical interests and influences. So the best way to look at what is happening with Russia, especially at this particular point where your Traore is going to face, the best way to look at it is from a geopolitical lens, where Russia is trying to reassert itself as a global power. Remember, after the collapse of the Soviet Union,
Mhm.
Russia really was never able to establish itself
Right.
to the status that it had, where it was either number one or number two. You remember during the Cold War, there were only two blocks,
Yeah.
the Western Bloc and the Soviet Bloc,
Right.
where Russia was at the center of it. Since the collapse of that, Russia has not been recognized as a major player, leave alone being the number one or the number two, because that coincided with the rise from the east of China. Then, even when we see the Western bloc dividing, it is not dividing where where Russia becomes the major player. There is the European Union, and the dominant power in Europe and within the European Union is Germany. So Russia is still trying to reestablish that. And one way that it has reestablished itself without any dispute is in being seen as a pariah state, as the bad boy of the west of the developed countries, fighting and attacking almost everybody. So in Africa, it is trying to have a different image because it is trying to get a different kind of support. So looking at it from that global geopolitical perspective of reestablishing itself, it is also trying to counter US and European influence, but at the same time, it is trying to replace some of these European countries that are losing favor in Africa. And the most dominant of this is France. There seems to be anti-French and anti-France sentiments in West Africa. So Russia is trying to position itself as a replacement. Whether it will be a better one, it's time will tell. Again, remember there is this loud but sounding nothing organization called the United Nations, where in the General Assembly most of the decisions are made by votes, where every country, every state has an equal vote. So Russia is trying to gain more support to be able to count itself as having the support of, even if not majority, at least something that cannot be called an insignificant minority.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow. So that was a very thorough explanation, but it was still simple enough to really follow. So thank you for that. Something that you mentioned was about Russia's trade, right? And how the United States and China kind of, usurped position number one and two, right? And how the USSR, after its crumbling, basically was no longer a power. China also has a large presence in Africa. China's presence is viewed as neo-colonialist, especially from I believe it was Kwame Nkrumah who warned about China's neo-colonialism, if I'm correct. Correct me if I'm wrong, by the way.
But Kwame Nkrumah died way before anybody was talking about China in Africa.
No, he mentioned China would be the new he mentioned neo-colonialism, I'm sorry, and how China is doing it now is similar to what he mentioned Africa's neo-colonialism would be like, if that makes sense, right?
It makes some sense,
okay.
But the question is, who is talking about that? It is the West warning Africa about China. And interestingly, it is saying the West is saying, we know how bad we were, but China is going to be either equally bad or worse than we were.
And that's what I'm asking, right? Is like, is that coming to be true? Because I'm not sure about that, right? China has yet to impose their language, right? And it's still early, right? China has yet to impose language. China has yet to impose any of the textbook imperialist forms of exertion of power, right? But remember, we're in a new day and age, and so those forms of power may not be current. So even if they wanted to do those things, they may not work. What would you say the differences between what China is doing and what Russia is proposing. Is what I said all that to say, right? What is the difference? Is China any different than Russia? And is Russia any different than China?
Again, remember the other day we were talking about some of the best lenses through which to answer a question like that.
Mm-hmm.
So let us just look at the interests. If they have similar interests, then the difference might just be in the tactics they use, but the end result will be the same. And both China and Russia, they are after Africa's natural resources. Let's not blind ourselves to anything else.
Mm-hmm.
That is what they are after.
Mm-hmm.
Africa is rich in oil, gas, gold, diamond, uranium, rare minerals, name it. And Russian companies are trying as hard as Chinese companies. And one thing that they have in common is that, unlike the West, and here we're talking of America and several European countries, where there tends to be a separate between these private companies that are coming to seek resources and the governments themselves. China and Russia, there is no distinction between the Chinese government, the Russian government, and these companies that are coming. Directly, these companies are doing the bidding of the Chinese government, the bidding of the Russian government, and they are coming to do exactly the same. The only difference seems to be that while the Chinese seem to be coming more from a commerce come trade lens,
mm-hmm.
the Russians are coming more through the export of military armsware and security support, and especially the protection of West African leaders through the Wagner Group.
Right.
So the Russians are more towards providing military assistance, which is what is needed. Remember, these are countries that have just taken over. We're talking about Mali, we're talking about Traore and several others. Senegal, although as a civilian government, has also decided to kick the French. So the Senegalese leader is going to behave exactly like Traore, afraid that they might be assassinated by the French. So they will very soon be seeking protection as if they were just a military junta. So you see, Russia is coming more telling them, I'm protecting you. This is West Africa is being threatened by Islamist jihadic movements. So they really need the Russian support. The Chinese promise trade. So other than just that distinction, whatever these two want is exactly the same. Natural resources and exploitation and their exploitation.
I understand. Now, here's the thing though, and this is something I'm trying to reconcile, right? What should he ask for in return for those things, right? Because again, that's essentially global trade, right? Global trade, the problem is not trade, the problem is unfair trade, right? Which would be they're not getting properly compensated for these natural resources that they're sharing. What would you say is proper compensation from the perspective of Russia?
We've just seen what Traore has done.
Mm-hmm.
Traore has just decided we are not selling our uranium to anybody. We are selling it to the market. We are not selling it. We are not going to sell it in a monopolistic way to the French. We are selling it in the market, and has changed probably the last 1 year. 1 year, his country has gained from uranium more. It has benefited from those sales more than all the other years that it has been independent combined.
Right.
But it's simply just selling it in the international market at fair prices.
Mhm.
So we see, and because of that, now he has a lot of resources that he can use for infrastructure and the development of his people. Remember what we were talking about the other day.
Mhm.
As long as you, as a military leader, you assure people and you prove through results that you are capable of doing something that civilian governments have been unable to do, you'll be surprised to find people who will tell you, pardon my French, screw democracy. We're not after the democracy as long as you are benefiting us. And remember our earlier discussions where we were asking why people are getting disillusioned
With
with
democracy.
democracy.
Mhm.
It is because democracy has become a benefitless thing. So you see, when you give people the benefits because that is what they wanted, not necessarily democracy, it's that democracy had promised them benefits which are no longer accruing. So as long as these new military leaders can provide these benefits, nobody will be talking about democracy. And this is why, again, you see many of them going towards the east because Russia is not propagating any democratic tenets to give and attaching aid to their aid or their assistance. At least it gives them leeway to do whatever they want as long as their relations are mutually beneficial.
Wow. Wow. So essentially then, no permanent enemies, no permanent allies. Russia is an ally today. Um and that's as good as you can get. Uh Secondly, if Russia is an ally today, what would have to happen for Russia to become, what should Africans be keen on when partnering with Russia that, could be a turning point from ally to colonizer?
Well, you see, right now, Russia is trying to survive and evade sanctions and economic sanctions from the West. Remember when it invaded Ukraine,
Yeah.
severe economic sanctions were put. So Russia is still seeing Africa as a way of evading these sanctions and as a way of now diversifying their economies and their sources of raw materials to get that. So as long as this war is still continuing, as long as Russia is still being considered a pariah state by the West, by European powers, by America, it is bound to behave. So African states can take advantage of this to institute and to negotiate contracts that will be mutually beneficial. If Africa had good negotiators, that is what they would be going for.
I see. So they should this is one of those and I'm starting to realize what you said in the first season. This is a wait and see tree, right? Because
Exactly.
you have to wait and see. Um I'm also starting to realize uh it's impeccable how Traore responds to people saying, "Oh, Russia is, a colonizer waiting to happen," right? But that's not that's not an immediate concern. Secondly,
Exactly.
it's also an imaginative concern right now because that bridge, we don't even know if that bridge exists to cross it, right? Um
Mhm.
and the evidence in the past is actually in favor of Russia. When Russia had chances to um, impose their language as well as even participate within, the Berlin Conference, they were present, but they didn't necessarily participate, especially to the extent. Now, granted, that's not necessarily because they weren't colonizers, right? It's more so because they already had their hands full with their local colonization, right? Like building the USSR took a lot, right? And it took a lot out of them, and they didn't have the effort or the resources to travel that far to Africa to handle those things. And so while we don't know whether or not that participate or lack of participation was from a benevolent lens, it still does work in their favor in this particular argument, right? And so when it comes to the next few years, how do you think African countries, like let's take Kenya for example, who has deep ties to the United States, to Israel, to the West, right? How would a country like Kenya or South Africa look at the relationship between Burkina Faso or the Sahel and Russia? And what do you think leaders from these countries are thinking as these relationships materialize? Do you think some of them will jump ship from the West and join Russia? And is this similar to the Red Scare with communism and things like that?
No, no, no. Actually, the easiest way of looking at this is nearer where you are than anything else. Look at what just a Trump presidency has changed the international system. Where things, when we were teaching, we used to tell our students that democracy is so good that there can never be a time where Canada and the United States can ever be thinking of war. We would tell our students that America, the relationships between America and Western European countries is so strong under NATO that they can't think of ever going to war. And Trump comes and all these things we had been teaching, they are challenged until anybody now going to, exactly anybody now going to college and seeing my notes just a few years back and what I had been saying would wonder whether I've ever gone to school or I had ever even looked at this. Mm-hmm. That is how the world in this era is changing, where friends are turning to foe and foes are turning into friends. And this really reminds me of the time immediately after the Second World War. Very few people still remember that the Soviet Union was on the same side with America. Yeah. And it is Japan and Germany that were on the other side.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, so this might be that timing point where realignments are taking place.
Wow. Wow.
So using the past to explain what is taking place now might be as absurd as driving using the side mirror, because you know more of where you are coming from than where you are going. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Man. So as far as weaponry and trade, right? You know, I saw some while I was doing the background research, I realized that one of the biggest things that people in Congo were talking about as it pertained to the Wagner group was that the French would train the French would train soldiers with wooden guns, right? Whereas the Russians would give them guns and they, you know, they wouldn't tell them what to do with them, right? They would be very hands off, just like you said. Do you think as African countries start to grow in their military capacity, what do you think the likelihood is that they will turn on Russians?
It's a very interesting question from an ignorant person.
Oh, really?
Let's go to the Congo that you've talked about.
Okay.
Even if you had the weapons, let's even say the Russians had the weapons, mm-hmm. Whom would they give? To the government? Which government? Mm. To the people? Which people? Mm. Because you see,
so it was less about the guns and more about the actual trainers that were coming, right?
But who are you training?
Yeah,
are
that's
you
what I'm
training? Yeah, because the Democratic Republic of Congo doesn't have a military. And that is why you find the neighbors have just groups of hired guns that they cause as much chaos internally as possible, because the government itself is afraid of arming its military because the government doesn't control the military. The Democratic Republic of Congo is so vast and so divided that nobody at the capital city controls the the interland.
Right.
So when you give weapons, are you giving the ones in the city, in the capital city? Are you giving only the soldiers that protect you as the president because you are afraid of arming others, and then because you know you have not been fair in distributing national resources?
That's exactly what
They
they
would
did.
want they would want to get their rightful share. What are you going to do?
Mm.
And this is why you find this is not something you can just blame external factors. Even when external factors come, they realize the only way to go about it is just exploit as quickly as you can and move. Because the person you might sign a contract with today might not be the one who will be there tomorrow. Will you keep on signing contracts with people who cannot implement them? Or you just decide, I'll go in where the resources are, I will do whatever it takes to exploit them, I'll pay whoever I have to pay to get them out. Once I get them out, I don't care what happens.
Mm. So Russia actually not only has a vested interest in Burkina Faso, but a vested interest in making sure Traore remains alive because they don't know if the next leader will have an allegiance to them.
That is it. Better the devil you know, and better
Right.
the devil you are dealing with now. And especially if that devil can risk their life to go to Russia,
Mm-hmm.
then that is the devil you need to do business with.
Right. Right. The last thing I'm going to ask you before we close this out is the overarching question is, what does Russia want with Africa? Why is it no one asks what the United States or China wants with Africa, right? Why is it no one asks what the West wants? Why is it that there is this microscopic lens on Russia and even China to some certain extent, right? Uh, but nowhere near the extent as Russia. Why is there always this microscopic lens on Russia's intents when we know America's history, we know America's intents, yet no one questions it?
You see again, you've asked a very interesting question, but you are forgetting. The only reason that you know what America is asking is because you speak that language.
Mm-hmm.
If you spoke Russian, you would know what the Russians are asking about America in Africa. If you spoke Chinese, you would know what the Chinese are asking. They are asking exactly the same questions.
Mm.
The only difference is that these questions are just being consumed where the language is consumed.
Right, right, right. That actually,
Yeah.
that makes perfect sense. That makes perfect sense, man. This is going to be very interesting to watch, especially because you know Western imperialist countries use the conflicts that were inside of Africa to exploit what's going on with Africa. And I think this might be the first time African countries can use the bickering and the fighting that's going on between Western nations against themselves, right? So this is the time to finally
That is true.
flip this on their tables, and I think we can really possibly do something with that. Thank you so much, Professor. Next time we talk, I definitely want to dive into how can we as Africans start to use some of the infighting that's occurring within Europe, within the West, among generally non-African peoples, to exploit it for Africa's benefit. That's a conversation I'd love to have, man.
Okay, we'll do it.
All right, no problem.